September 15th, 1940. 20,000 feet above the Kent countryside, southern England, the sky was impossibly blue. Not the pale, washed-out blue of a winter morning, but the deep, crystalline blue that comes only in early autumn, when the air is clear and cold, and every detail stands out with preternatural sharpness. Flight Lieutenant James Nicolson, 23 years old, could see the patchwork of fields far below, green and gold, stitched together by hedgerows that looked like dark thread from this altitude. His Hurricane fighter thrummed around him, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine producing its distinctive growl, a sound that was part roar, part purr. 12 cylinders of British engineering turning a three-bladed propeller at 2,000 revolutions per minute. The sound filled the cockpit, vibrated through the stick, entered his bones. It was a sound that had become, in the weeks since the battle began, something more than mechanical. It was defiance given voice. It was the sound of an island refusing to submit. Then the radio crackled. Bandits. Many bandits. Vector 180. Angels 20. 20,000 feet, heading north. Scramble. Nicholson banked the Hurricane, feeling the G-force press him into his seat, and turned south toward the channel. His eyes scanned the sky with the methodical sweep he had practiced 10,000 times. Left to right. Up and down, never staring at one point too long because that was how you missed the enemy coming out of the sun. The Merlin's growl deepened as he pushed the throttle forward. And then he saw them. At first, they were just dots against the blue, like pepper scattered across a tablecloth. But dots multiplied rapidly. Dots became shapes. Shapes became aircraft. Heinkel bombers in tight formation, their twin engines glinting in the sunlight, and above them, weaving back and forth in protective patterns, the fighters. Messerschmitt Bf 109s. He counted quickly, his mind doing the arithmetic even as his heart began to hammer against his ribs. 30 bombers, perhaps more. And the fighters, 20, maybe 25. 50 enemy aircraft in total, an armada of metal and men and bombs aimed at the heart of England. And between them and their target, there was him. One Hurricane, one pilot, one Merlin engine roaring its singular note of defiance into the vastness of the sky. This should not have happened. Every doctrine, every tactical manual, every lesson learned in the air war over France and the Channel stated clearly that a single fighter engaging a formation of this size was committing suicide. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. 50 guns against 8. 50 pairs of eyes against 1. The recommended response was to break off, to radio for support, to wait for one squadron to assemble before engaging. But Nicholson's squadron was scattered, its aircraft spread across the sky in the chaos that defined every scramble. The other pilots were minutes away. The bombers were here now, their bellies heavy with high explosives meant for London, for the docks. For the civilians huddled in shelters waiting for the all-clear that might never come. He checked his reflector sight, his fingers moving over the gun button on the control column. 8 Browning machine guns in the Hurricane's wings, each loaded with belt after belt of .303 ammunition. He had perhaps 15 seconds of continuous fire before the guns ran dry. 15 seconds to do what exactly? Damage one bomber? Perhaps 2 if he was extraordinarily lucky? The logic of the situation screamed at him to withdraw. The logic was sound. The logic made perfect sense. James Nicholson ignored the logic and opened the throttle wide. To understand the moment requires understanding the summer and autumn of 1940. Those months when Britain stood alone against a German war machine that had conquered Poland in weeks, France in days, and seemed utterly unstoppable. The Battle of Britain had begun in July, when Luftwaffe aircraft started appearing over the channel in numbers that seemed infinite. Hermann Göring, commander of the German Air Force, had promised Hitler that he could destroy the Royal Air Force in 4 days, neutralize Britain's fighter defenses in 4 weeks, and clear the way for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of the British Isles. The mathematics supported his confidence. Germany had over 1,300 bombers and 1,200 fighters available for the offensive. Britain could muster barely 700 fighters, and many of those were obsolescent types unsuitable for modern combat. But Göring's mathematics, like Nicholson's in the sky that September morning, did not account for everything. The Royal Air Force possessed 2 fighter types that would prove extraordinary: the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. The Spitfire received most of the glory, with its elegant elliptical wings and phenomenal performance. But the Hurricane was the workhorse, accounting for more kills during the Battle of Britain than all other defenses combined. It was rugged, stable, and forgiving, a gun platform that could absorb tremendous damage and still bring its pilot home. And both aircraft were powered by the same engine, the Merlin. That engine, with its distinctive sound that ranged from a guttural growl at low revs to a banshee scream at full throttle, became the acoustic signature of British resistance. German bomber crews learned to fear that sound, learned to scan the skies desperately when they heard it. Because it meant death was approaching at 300 miles per hour, the Germans expected the RAF to collapse. Their intelligence reports consistently underestimated British fighter strength, claiming the RAF was down to its last few dozen aircraft even as hundreds continued to rise to meet each raid. They expected British morale to shatter under the bombing, expected the civilian population to demand surrender, expected Churchill's government to see reason and negotiate. They had conquered a continent. Surely this small island, this antiquated empire clinging to its obsolete notions of sovereignty, would recognize the inevitable. What they encountered instead was a nation that had decided, with a stubbornness that bordered on the irrational, that surrender was simply not among the available options. Nicolson dove toward the bomber formation, his Hurricane screaming earthward, the Merlin's growl rising to a howl. The bombers grew rapidly in his windscreen, their shapes resolving into distinct aircraft. He could see the black crosses on their wings, the glazed noses where bombardiers crouched over their sights, the dorsal gun positions tracking his approach. The air suddenly came alive with tracer fire, glowing lines of light that seemed to move slowly at first, then accelerated to impossible speed as they flashed past his canopy. A bomber's defensive armament was formidable, usually 5 or 6 machine guns covering different angles. With 30 bombers, that meant over 150 guns that could potentially target him. The sky became a lattice of tracer rounds, and Nicolson flew into it as if threading a needle while riding a missile. He selected a Heinkel on the formation's edge, focused on it with the intensity of a man whose universe had contracted to a single target, and pressed the firing button. The Hurricane shuddered as all 8 guns opened fire simultaneously, their muzzles flashing, the smell of cordite flooding the cockpit. He could see his rounds striking the bomber, see pieces of metal breaking away from the wing, see the port engine trail smoke. He held the button down for 3 seconds, 4, then broke off hard right as return fire converged on his position. Something struck his aircraft with a metallic bang. The stick went mushy in his hands for a terrifying instant, then responded again. He rolled, climbed, came around for another pass. The German fighter escort had noticed him now. 3 Messerschmitts broke formation and dove to intercept, their yellow noses bright against the sky. The Bf-109 was faster than the Hurricane in level flight and could outclimb it at most altitudes. In a straight chase, Nicolson would lose. But air combat was rarely about straight lines. It was about angles, energy management, split-second decisions made with incomplete information while pulling forces that grayed out your vision and turned your head into lead. The Hurricane could turn inside a 109. That margin, a few degrees of turn radius, was the difference between life and death. Nicolson pulled the Hurricane into a tight climbing turn, feeling the G-forces compress his body, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. The Merlin engine roared its defiance, the sound filling his ears, drowning out thought, becoming a kind of primal scream. The 109s flashed past below him, their closure rate too high, their attacks uncoordinated. He reversed the turn, dove back toward the bombers, and fired another burst into a different Heinkel. This time he saw the dorsal gunner slump in his position, saw the aircraft waver in formation. Then he was through the formation and climbing again, the bombers behind him, his fuel gauge dropping, his ammunition counters unwinding. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. In that span, James Nicolson made 7 separate attacks on the bomber formation. He damaged at least 4 aircraft severely enough that they later fell out of formation. He shot down 1 Heinkel outright, watching it spiral earthward trailing smoke and flame. He survived attacks by multiple fighters, evaded flak from the bomber's defensive guns, and kept his Hurricane in the air despite accumulating hits that perforated his wings and fuselage. And all the while, the Merlin engine howled and growled. and sang, never missing a beat, never faltering, pulling him through turns that should have ripped the wings off, powering him back into the fight again and again. Then his fuel ran critically low. The red warning light illuminated on the instrument panel. He had perhaps 5 minutes of flying time remaining. The bomber formation, harried and disrupted, had broken up, individual aircraft scattering, some turning back toward France. The fighters that had chased him had given up, returning to their charges. The sky was suddenly empty except for wisps of smoke marking where aircraft had died. Nicolson turned for home. His hands were shaking on the stick. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the freezing cold at altitude. His ears rang from the engine noise and the gunfire. He realized he had been holding his breath and gulped air, his lungs burning. The Merlin settled into its cruising rhythm, that steady growl that was almost comforting now, and he began the descent toward his airfield. He landed with fuel for perhaps 2 more minutes of flight. When the ground crew swarmed the Hurricane, they counted 47 bullet holes in the airframe. The rudder was shredded. One aileron had a hole large enough to put a fist through. The armored plate behind the pilot's seat had stopped 3 rounds that would otherwise have killed him. The crew chief stared at the damage with the expression of a man who had seen miracles but refused to believe in them. He asked Nicolson what had happened. Nicolson, climbing stiffly from the cockpit, his legs trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline crash, said simply, "Ran into some Germans. Spoiled their day somewhat." The British gift for understatement was alive and well. What happened in the sky over Kent on September 15, 1940, was not unique to James Nicolson. It was replicated, with variations, dozens of times every day throughout that summer and autumn. Outnumbered pilots engaging superior forces. Aircraft flying past the point of mechanical endurance. Men continuing to fight when every rational calculation said they should retreat. The RAF fought the Battle of Britain with a ferocity that defied its numerical disadvantage. And it won. Not easily. Not without terrible cost. But it won. September 15th would later be designated Battle of Britain Day, the point at which the Luftwaffe's offensive reached its climax and broke. The Germans lost over 60 aircraft that day. The RAF lost half that number, and more importantly, most of its downed pilots survived, parachuting to safety or crash landing in friendly territory. The invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. Hitler turned his attention eastward, toward the Soviet Union, a decision that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. And the pilots of Fighter Command, flying their Hurricanes and Spitfires, powered by those magnificent Merlin engines, entered legend. But legends obscure as much as they illuminate. The popular imagination tends to frame the battle in terms of heroism and bravery, and certainly both were present in abundance. But what made the RAF effective was not primarily individual courage. It was a system. It was the integration of radar stations that gave early warning of raids. It was the fighter control rooms that vectored aircraft to intercept. It was the training system that, while abbreviated by wartime necessity, still produced pilots who understood deflection shooting and energy tactics. It was the maintenance crews that kept aircraft flying despite shortages of parts and impossible workloads. It was the production system that replaced losses faster than the Germans anticipated. And yes, it was those Merlin engines, products of Rolls-Royce engineering and British manufacturing, reliable and powerful, turning propellers that pulled young men into the sky to face death with regularity. The sound of the Merlin became symbolic in ways that transcended mere mechanics. German bomber crews, interviewed after the war, consistently mentioned it. They described hearing that distinctive roar and knowing that British fighters were close, that the mission was about to become a gauntlet of fire and fear. They described the psychological weight of that sound, the way it seemed to come from everywhere at once, the way it preceded attacks that came too fast to counter. One Luftwaffe pilot, speaking decades later, said, "We heard that engine and knew we were not fighting just a pilot. We were fighting Britain itself." The sound was their voice, telling us we would not pass. There is deep truth in that statement. The Merlin's roar was more than engine noise. It was the acoustic embodiment of a nation's refusal to accept defeat. Britain in 1940 had no rational reason to continue fighting. Its army had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind all its heavy equipment. Its allies had fallen. Its cities were being bombed nightly. The German military appeared invincible. Any sober assessment of the strategic situation would conclude that negotiation was the sensible course. But Britain did not negotiate. It fought on with a stubbornness that appeared, to outside observers, almost pathological. That stubbornness had roots in British history and culture, the same island mentality that had resisted Napoleon, the same parliamentary tradition that limited monarchical power, the same individualism that chafed under authority even while respecting it. But it also had roots in something more immediate, the belief that fascism represented an existential threat not just to Britain, but to the very concept of human freedom. Churchill articulated this in his speeches, but the pilots lived it in the air. They were not fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for the right to remain free, to govern themselves, to reject totalitarianism. And that motivation proved more durable than anyone expected. The Germans never quite understood this. Their ideology emphasized collective will, racial destiny, the subordination of individual desire to state objectives. They expected others to crack under pressure because, in their system, individual initiative was discouraged, independent thought was suspect, and obedience was paramount. They could not comprehend a military force composed of individuals who thought for themselves, who made tactical decisions in the moment, who fought not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. The RAF pilot culture encouraged initiative. Tactics were suggestions, not gospel. Men like Nicolson were trusted to assess situations and act accordingly. When he saw 50 enemy aircraft and attacked alone, he was not following doctrine. He was making a judgment that the situation demanded action, consequences be damned. That capacity for independent action, multiplied across hundreds of pilots, created an emergent effectiveness that was greater than the sum of its parts. The Luftwaffe, despite its numerical advantage, could not suppress it. The more they attacked, the more ferociously they were met. The more certain they became of imminent victory, the more stubbornly the RAF resisted. And slowly, across those crucial months, the psychological balance shifted. The Germans began to doubt. The British began to believe. James Nicholson's single-handed attack on a 50-aircraft formation did not change the strategic calculus of the battle, but it was symptomatic of the spirit that did. His action was one thread in a tapestry of similar actions, each individually small, collectively transformative. The intelligence reports flowing back to Göring and Hitler began to reflect this reality. The RAF was not collapsing. British fighter strength was not diminishing. If anything, resistance was stiffening. The invasion window was closing. The weather would soon turn. And the pilots in their Hurricanes and Spitfires, those engines roaring defiance, continued to rise and fight. Nicholson's Hurricane, after being patched up, flew again. The ground crew worked through the night, replacing damaged sections, re-rigging controls, test-firing guns. By dawn on September 16th, the aircraft was operational. It flew 17 more combat sorties before being shot down on November 3rd. Its pilot on that final mission survived, parachuting into the channel and being rescued by a motor launch. The Hurricane itself sank in 30 fathoms of water, taking with it the scars of battle, the bullet holes that had been repaired and repaired again, the history encoded in its stressed metal. But the Merlin engine, before it was swallowed by the sea, made that sound one last time. The growl, the roar, the defiant scream that had become the voice of Britain's refusal to submit. After the war, when historians began to analyze the Battle of Britain, they focused on the strategic elements, the failure of German intelligence, the effectiveness of British radar, the production rates of aircraft. These were important, but there was also an intangible element that resisted quantification. Morale, will, the sheer bloody-minded determination to keep fighting when fighting seemed futile. This was not unique to the British. Every nation that resisted fascism drew on similar reserves. But Britain in 1940 displayed it at a moment when the world was watching, when the outcome hung in balance, when surrender would have been understandable and resistance seemed quixotic. The pilots were not superhuman. They were young men, most in their early 20s, many with less than 100 hours of flight time. They got tired. They made mistakes. They died in shocking numbers. Over 500 RAF fighter pilots were killed during the battle, and many more were wounded or burned. They knew the odds. They flew anyway. They climbed into cockpits morning after morning, wound up those Merlin engines, and took off toward whatever the day would bring. Some days they encountered nothing. Some days they fought multiple engagements. Some days they did not come back. James Nicolson flew through the battle and survived the war, though he was shot down multiple times and wounded repeatedly. He received the Victoria Cross for his actions, the only fighter pilot in the battle to be so honored. The citation read, "For most conspicuous bravery during an engagement with the enemy." The dry bureaucratic language could not capture what he had done. But then, language often fails at the extremes of human experience. What matters is that he did it. That hundreds like him did similar things. That the collective weight of those individual decisions shifted history. After the war, Nicolson rarely spoke about his experiences. This was typical of his generation. The men who had fought did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as ordinary people who had been asked to do extraordinary things. When pressed, they spoke about the aircraft, the tactics, the friends they had lost. They deflected praise. They minimized their accomplishments. Nicolson, asked once how he had felt attacking 50 enemy aircraft alone, thought for a long moment before answering. "I did not think about the number. I thought about the target. One aircraft at a time. You cannot shoot down 50 planes. But you can shoot down one. Then another. Then another. You do what is in front of you." It was an echo of what the Marines at the Cormackina Bridge would say 3 years later. The same understanding that overwhelming tasks become manageable when broken into component parts. The same focus on the immediate, the achievable, the next step rather than the distant goal. This was not taught in manuals. It was learned in combat, or perhaps it was a trait that combat revealed in those who possessed it. The Merlin engine continued in service long after the Battle of Britain ended. It powered later variants of the Spitfire and Hurricane. It powered the P-51 Mustang, the American fighter that would escort bombers all the way to Berlin. It powered the Lancaster bomber, the heavy bomber that carried the war to German cities. It was manufactured in the tens of thousands. Each engine a mechanical marvel of precision engineering, cylinders hand-fitted, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, components machined to standards that pushed contemporary manufacturing to its limits. It was a product of a democratic industrial society that valued innovation, that protected intellectual property rights, that rewarded engineering excellence, that maintained educational systems producing skilled workers and designers. It was, in short, a product of the system it defended. The symbolic resonance of this should not be overlooked. The totalitarian powers believed that centralized control produced superior results, that democracy was weak and inefficient, that individual freedom was a luxury incompatible with modern industrial warfare. The Merlin engine was a refutation of that belief. It was designed by private companies operating in a competitive market. It was manufactured by a mix of skilled craftsmen and semi-skilled workers, many of them women, empowered to make decisions and suggest improvements. It was constantly refined through feedback from pilots who flew combat missions and reported what worked and what did not. This iterative process, this feedback loop between user and designer, this incorporation of frontline experience into engineering refinement, these were features of an open system, a democratic system, a system that trusted individuals to contribute their expertise, and it produced an engine that worked, that ran when it was supposed to run, that could be maintained under field conditions, that could absorb battle damage and continue functioning, that gave pilots the power and reliability they needed to survive. The Merlin's growl was the sound of democratic engineering applied to the problem of survival, and it proved more effective than the centralized engineering of the fascist powers. This is not to romanticize Britain or democracy. Both had profound flaws, contradictions, hypocrisies. British imperialism was indefensible. Democratic systems had failed to prevent the war, had appeased aggression, had made catastrophic miscalculations. But in the specific crucible of the Battle of Britain, the British system produced results that the German system could not match. It produced pilots who could think for themselves. It produced engines that did not fail. It produced a resilience that bent under pressure but did not break. James Nicholson's Hurricane, with its Merlin roaring, diving toward 50 enemy aircraft, was a manifestation of that resilience. The mathematical absurdity of the action, 1 against 50, was precisely what made it effective. The Germans expected rational behavior. They expected cost-benefit calculations. They expected opponents to recognize when they were outmatched and withdraw. They did not expect pilots to attack anyway, to ignore the odds, to throw themselves into combat with a ferocity that suggested they had already accepted death and were now simply focused on taking as many enemies with them as possible. But that was not what motivated Nicolson. He had not accepted death. He had accepted duty. There is a subtle but crucial difference. Accepting death is passive, fatalistic. Accepting duty is active. It means recognizing an obligation and fulfilling it regardless of personal cost. The obligation was to stop the bombers, or at least to try. The cost was irrelevant. This was not suicidal. It was purposeful. He intended to survive. He simply intended to do his job first, and if survival was compatible with that, excellent. If not, the job still took priority. This hierarchy of values, duty before survival, is what created the RAF's effectiveness. Not every pilot embodied it. Some broke under the strain. Some were rotated out of combat, their nerves shattered. But enough embodied it, enough of the time, to tip the balance. The Luftwaffe could not sustain the losses they were taking. Their bomber crews began to show signs of deteriorating morale. Their fighter pilots, flying at the edge of their range over hostile territory, knowing that a single hit could mean ditching in the channel, began to husband their aggressiveness. And the RAF, bleeding and exhausted, held by late September. The character of the German offensive had changed. Goring shifted from daylight raids to night bombing, from targeting airfields to targeting cities. This was tactically easier. Night fighters were primitive, and darkness provided protection. But it was also a strategic admission of failure. The Luftwaffe had not destroyed the RAF. It had not achieved air superiority. The invasion could not proceed. The battle, though it continued in various forms until October, was effectively over. Britain had survived. The long-term consequences of this survival are difficult to overstate. Britain became the base from which the eventual liberation of Europe was launched. It provided a haven for governments in exile, for resistance movements, for the planning and preparation that would culminate in D-Day. It remained a thorn in the side of the German war machine, forcing the dispersal of resources, preventing a total focus on the Eastern Front. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be resisted, that its apparently unstoppable advance could be halted, that free nations willing to fight had a chance. This demonstration had effects far beyond military strategy. It influenced American public opinion, making it easier for Roosevelt to provide aid and eventually to enter the war. It heartened resistance movements across occupied Europe. It gave the Soviet Union, after Hitler's invasion in June 1941, a fighting ally rather than a defeated former adversary. The Battle of Britain was Britain's gift to the broader alliance against fascism, proof that resistance was possible, that the costs were bearable, that victory, while distant, was achievable, none of which was evident to James Nicolson as he lined up his Hurricane for another attack on September 15, 1940. He knew only that there were bombers ahead, and that his job was to stop them. The Merlin engine roared. The gun button waited under his thumb. The sky stretched infinite and blue around him. And he flew into the teeth of the enemy formation. 1 man against 50, logic be damned. Years after the war, when Nicolson was asked to reflect on the Battle of Britain, he spoke about the sound of the Merlin. He said it was the sound that defined the summer of 1940 for him and for everyone who flew. The ground crews heard it at dawn as the fighters scrambled, heard it at dusk as the survivors limped home. The civilians heard it overhead, dogfights spinning across the sky like deadly ballet. The pilots lived inside it, the sound filling the cockpit, vibrating through the airframe, a constant presence that became almost a companion. He said that after the war, he would sometimes hear a particular engine note, a motorcycle, a car revving, and for a moment, he would be back in the Hurricane, back at 20,000 feet, back in the sky over England when the world hung in balance. The sound carried memory. The sound was a time machine. The sound was the voice of a moment when ordinary people became extraordinary, not through transformation, but through simple, stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable. The Hurricane that Nicolson flew on September 15th was scrapped after the war. Its remains were smelted down, turned into new metal, recycled into the peacetime economy. But Hurricanes survive in museums, maintained in flying condition by enthusiasts who understand their historical significance. When these aircraft take to the air at air shows and commemorations, when their Merlin engines roar to life and that distinctive sound rolls across the airfield, old men who flew them pause and listen. Some smile, some weep. All remember. What they remember is not just combat, not just fear and loss and exhaustion. They remember being young and being part of something larger than themselves. They remember believing that what they did mattered, that their individual actions contributed to a collective purpose, that flying into impossible odds was justified by the cause they served. They remember a clarity of purpose that peacetime rarely provides. They remember, in short, a moment when the choices were stark and the stakes were absolute, and the outcome was uncertain, but the obligation was crystal clear. Fight. That single word encapsulates the Battle of Britain. Not fight and win, because victory was not guaranteed. Not fight intelligently, or fight with caution, or fight within acceptable risk parameters. Just fight. Get in the aircraft. Start the engine. Take off. Find the enemy. Engage. Return if possible. Repeat. Day after day after day. Until the enemy stops coming or you stop returning. Those were the parameters. The RAF accepted them and operated within them, and, in doing so, wrote one of the great chapters in the history of human resistance to tyranny. James Nicolson attacking 50 aircraft alone was absurd. It was tactically questionable. It risked a valuable fighter and an experienced pilot for minimal strategic gain. It violated every principle of force preservation and calculated risk. And it was exactly what the moment required. Not because it inflicted decisive damage, it did not, but because it represented an attitude, a spirit, a refusal to accept that numbers determined outcomes. Nicholson's action was a microcosm of the broader battle, numerically inferior forces engaging superior enemies, because the alternative was surrender. And surrender was not negotiable. The Germans never understood this. They kept waiting for the British to be reasonable, to recognize reality, to acknowledge that continuing to fight was pointless. They misunderstood the nature of what they faced. They thought they were fighting a country. They were fighting an idea. The idea that freedom mattered more than survival. That some things were worth dying for. That a small island could defy a continent if the island believed in itself and the continent doubted. Belief is a powerful force. It does not make bullets miss or engines run without fuel. But it keeps men climbing into aircraft day after day despite horrific casualties. It keeps ground crews working 20-hour shifts to repair battle damage. It keeps a nation digging in, preparing for invasion, refusing to contemplate defeat. The British in 1940 believed, not that they would win, not even that they could win, but that they must fight regardless. That belief, irrational as it was, proved more durable than German confidence, which evaporated when quick victory did not materialize. The sound of the Merlin engine became the anthem of that belief. Hear it roar, and know that Britain still fights. Hear it fade into the distance, and know that another patrol is heading toward the enemy. Hear it return, coughing and sputtering, and know that another pilot has survived another mission. The sound carried meaning beyond acoustics. It was communication, declaration, defiance compressed into mechanical vibration. When Nicholson finally left the RAF after the war, he tried to return to civilian life, to forget, to move on. It did not work. The war stayed with him, as it stayed with all who fought it. Not as trauma, necessarily, though there was that too, but as a reference point, a touchstone, a period of life when everything was simplified to its essence. He died in 1945, shortly after the war's end, in an aviation accident while serving with a transport unit. He was 29 years old. His Victoria Cross is displayed in a museum. His story is told and retold, embellished in some versions, simplified in others. But the core remains, a pilot who saw 50 enemy aircraft and attacked alone because that was his job. The story defied logic then. It defies logic now. Logic says one does not engage 50 opponents single-handedly. Logic says survival requires caution. Logic says heroism is for fools and madmen. But logic operates in the realm of the calculable, and some human experiences transcend calculation. They exist in the realm of duty, honor, commitment to something beyond the self. Nicholson flew into that realm on September 15, 1940, and brought back proof that it exists, that it is accessible to ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. that the sound of a Merlin engine roaring defiance is sometimes the most rational response to an irrational world. The Battle of Britain ended in October 1940. The Blitz continued for months afterward. German bombs falling on London and other cities, killing civilians, destroying homes, testing national morale. But the existential threat had passed. The invasion was postponed, then cancelled. The Luftwaffe had failed in its primary mission. The RAF, outnumbered and outgunned, had held. The margin was narrow. The cost was high. But the outcome was clear. Britain survived. That survival meant the war continued. Meant the alliance against fascism retained a foothold in Europe. Meant the eventual liberation became possible. Meant the darkness did not cover everything. And it was purchased, in part, by pilots like James Nicolson, flying Hurricanes powered by Merlin engines, attacking impossible odds, doing what needed doing because someone had to do it, and they were there, and the choice was simple: fight or surrender. They chose to fight. They chose to ignore the mathematics. They chose to trust their training, their aircraft, their engines, and themselves. And they won. Not every engagement, not every day, but in the aggregate, across the summer and autumn of 1940, they accumulated enough small victories to produce a large one. They made the sound of the Merlin engine a symbol of resistance, a promise that tyranny could be opposed, a declaration that freedom, for all its messy inefficiencies, could mobilize resources and inspire sacrifices that totalitarianism could not match. The legacy of that battle lives on in the aircraft preserved in museums, in the memorials that the English countryside, in the stories passed down through generations. But it lives most powerfully in the understanding that ordinary people, when confronted with extraordinary evil, can rise to meet it. They will not all be heroes. Many will fail. Some will break. But enough will stand, will fight, will refuse to submit. And sometimes, against all logic, against all odds, that is enough. One British pilot against 50 enemy planes. The outcome became a story that defied all logic. But perhaps the deeper truth is that logic, while useful, is not the ultimate arbiter of what is possible. Courage is. Determination is. The willingness to do what must be done, regardless of odds, regardless of risk, regardless of what the calculators and strategists say, is the force that changes history. James Nicolson, in his Hurricane, with his Merlin engine roaring, proved that truth 20,000 feet above Kent on a crystalline September morning. The sky was impossibly blue. The enemy was impossibly numerous. The mission was impossible. He did it anyway. And in doing so, he added his voice to the chorus of defiance that saved a nation and, perhaps, a world. The sound of that defiance still echoes. Listen carefully, and you can hear it. The growl, the roar, the unconquerable scream of freedom refusing to die. If you like the video, hit like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real WW2 stories every day. Thanks for watching.